Welcome to the Speaking of Writers podcast. I'm Steve Richards. As America approaches its 250th anniversary, we are doing a special America 250 series exploring the people, events, and documents that shaped the nation's history. Today's guest is historian, professor, and acclaimed author Robert P. Watson. In his fascinating new book, Declaration, The Story of American Independence, Watson takes readers beyond the familiar legends surrounding the Declaration of Independence to uncover the debates, personalities, political tensions, and untold stories behind one of the most important documents ever written. Drawing from letters, diaries, newspapers, and historical records, the book explores not only the founding fathers, but also the roles played by women, enslaved individuals, indigenous peoples, and ordinary colonists whose voices and experiences shaped the American Revolution. Robert P. Watson is Distinguished Professor of American History at Avron Fogelman Research Professor at Lynn University and the author of nearly 50 books on American politics and history. I'm happy to have back on this podcast, now in video, Robert Watson. Welcome.
Steve, thank you. Good to be back with you. And I said this off air. Let me say it on air. Thank you for what you do to support writing, reading, books, authors. This is wonderful stuff. Thank you.
I appreciate that. Thank you, Robert. So as we approach the big 250th anniversary, what do you think people misunderstand most about the Declaration of Independence?
So one of my, I guess, a sweet spot, something I like to do is to go through textbooks and figure out what we get wrong about history, all the little legends that don't quite add up about history. And there's so much about the Declaration and founding that doesn't add up. And I guess that makes sense. One, it was so long ago. Two, I think every nation, every culture, every group of people, they need to almost deify, their founders, and turn them, turn George Washington into marble, basically. So for all those reasons, there's a lot we get wrong. One of them is Independence Day is not July 4th. We celebrate the wrong day. July 2nd is Independence Day. That's when they voted for what they called independency. It was on July 2. Then on July 3, two things happened. John Adams wrote a letter to Abigail, his wife, saying, generations of Americans will long celebrate July 2nd as Independence Day. So got that one wrong. But the other thing that happened on July 3rd was they debated the actual document, the Declaration. Then on July 4th, they approved the document. So we celebrate the document, not the act that it affirmed, which is kind of interesting. So that's, an obvious one. And I think a second obvious one is Thomas Jefferson gets all the credit. Mr. Jefferson should get some credit. He spent 17 days in a second-story loft at the Graff House. Graff was a bricklayer in Philadelphia, putting together the draft of the Declaration. But it was heavily edited. Probably the main editor was Ben Franklin. John Adams contributed. The entire convention contributed. So there were a lot of changes. It's hard to put a number next to it, but maybe 40% of the document was changed. And we know a lot of this because Thomas Jefferson, who I think has had the world's greatest publicist, Jefferson is a bit whiny, a bit affected, a bit he's a complainer. He's a difficult guy to like, I find. A genius, no question. But unlike a Ben Franklin or others, or John Adams, who's so bluntly honest, Hamilton, who's suicidally brave on the battlefield, then you have Jefferson, who's complicit and whiny. But the good news is Jefferson was so upset that they, quote unquote, mangled his brilliance, that when Franklin would take something out or add something, Jefferson would recopy the whole document and point out what they changed. And he gave copies to his, good friend James Madison and others. So as a way of showing how it was ruined. But the kicker is, and anyone who sits down and reads the changes goes, oh, that's way better. Thanks, Ben Franklin. So Jefferson does deserve credit for his, as they rap in the musical Hamilton, you might say he had the skill with the quill, right? He was a great writer. And I guess, there's so much more, but as you mentioned, the contributions by immigrants, women, and others, unfortunately, those stories have largely been excluded from the narrative. And the very first copy of the Declaration, we call it the Dunlap Broadside. That was the July 4, 76 copy. It was actually printed by an immigrant. His name was John Dunlap, who printed 200 copies. And this may not sound like much of a contribution, but remember, a lot of the founders thought that it wasn't if, but when they'll be swinging from a British noose for treason, right? And they didn't think that they would necessarily pull this war off. I mean, look at it this way: when in mid-April of 1775, when shots were fired at Lexington and Concord, we didn't have a general, we didn't have an army, we didn't have a capital, we didn't have a currency, we didn't have a flag, we didn't have a national anthem. I mean, it wasn't audacious, it was foolishness, it was suicidal. So a lot of them worried that they'd be swinging. So John Dunlap, this Irish immigrant, rendered a brave and great service. He printed the first 200 copies, so that's why we call it the Dunlap broadside. So there are all sorts of little stories that I think are just deliciously compelling. And probably, they always say the real stories were even better than the one that Hollywood or pop culture fabricates. But so a lot of these are good stories. So you imagine old John Dunlap in his office printing, wondering if he knew that he was changing the world, but also at the same time keeping the door locked, thinking the British are going to bust in or one of their loyalists are going to, release his name and he's going to be swinging. His press will be burned down, and there we go. So good. Those are a couple of them, Steve.
How divided were the colonies leading up to July 1776?
Ridiculously divided. One way to look at it is militiamen from South Carolina would refuse to fight under an officer from North Carolina. I mean, they were still arguing about the border between the two. So yeah, they were very divided. The three northern states that carried the brunt of everything, New York, Massachusetts, and Pennsylvania, were divided. There were constant arguments. The delegates were divided. We have this image of them standing around like Captain Morgan, looking like all happy and getting along. Not so. In fact, John Adams, who lived a really long life, lived until 1826. Adams, afterwards, he was asked by an artist to come in and look at this beautiful giant mural that they painted, this big painting of all the founders standing around getting along. And he said, that's not how it was. We were arguing. So it was very difficult to make these colonies come together as one. So that's another irony of it, to the point where, and I've said in a book, and I've said it, and I wrote about George Washington elsewhere, and I wrote about the Revolutionary War elsewhere, that if you replay this 10 times, I think it's a safe bet to say 8 or 9 of them we don't win, we don't make it. So from the ragtag band of poorly trained farmers and ill-equipped blacksmiths against the world's greatest military, to the fact that they didn't get along, to the fact that you remove George Washington from the equation, and I don't see anyone else truly. And I know that sounds like it's an over-glorification of George, but I think he's worth the accolades. I just don't see anyone else pulling this off. You remove Ben Franklin's diplomacy in Europe. Ben was the one that said, look, we got one shot at this. If we get money from the Dutch and Spanish, if we get ships and powder and something new called a bayonet, if we get all this from the French, we got a shot. But Franklin sets sail on a secret mission. They don't want to let people know what port, what ship, what day, what time. Because if the British find out and sink it, Steve, you and I are drinking tea after this after this podcast.
Yeah.
But here's another way to look at Ben Franklin's mission. He has to go to France and convince a monarch to support a movement against monarchs. And he does it. And Louis was darn near as whacked as George III. And it's one of these things. If we get sort of like the planning of D-Day, everything has to go right, kind of a thing. And nothing did at D-Day. But everything has to go right. But even if everything did go right, I don't know that it would have happened. But King George III was so unfit to be a leader, and Parliament was in the hands of just some, rabid, knee-jerk arch nationalists, that they made every single mistake in the book. Which allowed us, the same way the Hitler and the Nazis made almost every mistake in the book. So you put all that together, and boy, it makes a great story.
Yeah, it is. I remember watching the Ken Burns series, and after
Mm,
it, I said to my wife, my biggest takeaway, I don't know how we won.
I know.
All
I say
the
that.
stories I hadn't heard,
Yeah,
what went
I
on in
say that
that. And I
too.
was like, I don't know how we won, but we did.
Oh, there were battles like in Long Island, Brooklyn,
Yeah.
where Washington came this close to being captured and cut off. And I mean, he literally spent the war either A, running,
Yeah.
fleeing. In fact, one joke, I think I put it in a book, and several noted historians have said it. Can't remember if it was in the Burns documentary or not, but Washington became a master of redeployment. He was
Yeah.
nobody redeployed better than him. But that is a skill. He has
Yeah.
to take untrained 19-year-olds who have never been away from home, facing the world's greatest, most disciplined military, and get the heck out of there. Uh, I mean, but then they don't have money. They're running out of clothing. They're running out of powder. And a lot of the farmers today, we would say defense contractors, suppliers, are you going to give this to the militia who's not going to pay you and they're going to lose and then you'll be hanged, or B, are you going to give it to the British who pay? um, so a lot of them were working with the British for the simple economic reality. They needed to eat. We had virtually no navy. The British controlled our ports. It cut off trade and fishing. I mean, this is, again, like I said, it's not audacious. It's foolish. It's
Yeah.
suicidal. But thank goodness they did it.
Yeah. And how devastating disease was, too. That was
Oh,
another big takeaway. Devastating for the troops.
devastating. And we have to remember, well, I mean, we all went through COVID, which was alarming, scary. Today people are worried about Ebola, and the world still, lives under the threat of avian flu and malaria and yellow fever. Every year, these things claim countless lives around the world. But back in the 1700s, we did not have the medicine or technology or the understanding. So people didn't know where these things came from. For example, I wrote a different book. I was inspired during COVID to do this. When was our first pandemic? So I wrote about this yellow fever outbreak in 1793. It was Washington's first year in his second term. And the superstition was my takeaway. So people didn't know where these diseases came from. I mean, the wrath of God, and there was really no known cure. Doctors were also barbers who would bleed or leech you. I mean, it was alarming, and the disease would just tear through these camps. You look at the death toll at Valley Forge or Morristown or
Yeah.
any one of the winter. These and the soldiers were literally freezing and dying. And you wonder how many times Washington must have sat up at night telling Hamilton or John Lawrence or Martha, are we going to even have an army to field in the spring when the weather gets better?
Yeah.
And meanwhile, Congress is incompetent, and at one point literally packed up in Philadelphia and skedaddled before the British
Right.
marched in. Right. And they couldn't fund it. And wow, it's just neighbor against neighbor. So it was an impossible. And I just think um, any historian or folks like you and I that talk about this, it's easy to say 8 or 9 out of 10 times this doesn't work,
Yeah.
um, but it did.
The painting over my shoulder on your book. Beautiful. Where did that
It's my
come from?
favorite picture of the revolution. Yeah.
Yeah.
So in 50 books, I think I've been able to pick the cover for maybe three. I mean,
Mhm.
publishers always say we have marketing people, and I'm like, no, I got the perfect cover. Fortunately, Bloomsbury Press, props to them, great publishing
Yeah.
house. They agreed with this because I said this is probably the single most accurate image of the revolution that exists. It shows there was in June of 75, so this is 1 month before, less than 1 month before, Richard Henry Lee of the Lee dynasty, a tall, charismatic, powerful, rich. He had the gravitas. He gets up during one of the endless debates about reconciliation, which is another thing we get wrong. We assume everybody favored independence. Most of them favored reconciliation. And we even sent what we called olive branch petitions to the king. Please, we're fellow Englishmen. We speak the language. We have the same clothing, same culture. We have family back in England. But George III blew every single one opportunity, fortunately. But Richard Henry Lee stands up and he says, I move that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states. And I demand we put a committee together now and we move on this. In other words, enough with all this reconciliation. And if any one of the other founders had said that, with the exception of Ben Franklin, I think Hancock and everybody would have went, yeah, okay, whatever, next.
Yeah.
But because it was him, they put a committee together of 5 people. They called it not very creative. They called it the Committee of Five. Livingston, Sherman. It was co-chaired by the 2 folks in that painting, Adams and Franklin, and then Jefferson. And Jefferson, as you can see from the painting, was very tall and very young. He was 33, looking like 23. He was 6'2", which of course back then would make him, if you extrapolate to today, he'd be about 6'7", 6'8". And it also shows Jefferson's work all over the floor, crumbled up, presumably by him, when Ben Franklin made the changes. Even what they were wearing and the model ship hanging that Jefferson described in one of his letters. So whomever painted this really did their homework. And I really think it shows the committee during this fantastic moment in late June and early July of 76, writing what would be one of the most important documents in human history. And, we hold these truths to be self-evident, perhaps the most important sentence in history and the most important introduction. And the 3 of them were smart enough. They also had big enough egos I think they knew that what they were sitting there doing was changing the world. So I think it wasn't one of these, oh, we have a deadline, let's hurry and finish this. I'm going to go out for dinner or go see my friends. I think they were sitting there realizing that they were changing the world. In fact, Jefferson was, even kept copies of everything so that in 50 years or 200 years, we would know how smart he was. He was actually concerned about us. I don't know what I'm doing tomorrow, Steve. So he was thinking about what are people going to say in 200 years. But Ben Franklin has one of my all-time favorite aspects of this whole story and the book, and my 36 years as a professor now writing history, is Ben Franklin had this view that we might not win the war. We might not even sign the Declaration. And it's kind of hypocritical. Jefferson has slaves, and he's writing that all men are created equal. We're here in Philadelphia, which at the time was by far the most progressive city in the country. And they had a law that if you were enslaved and you were in Philadelphia a certain number of days, you were automatically freed. So what a lot of the Southern delegates did is they brought, a wagon, and they would shuttle their slaves back and forth so they wouldn't hit the maximum number of days. So Franklin saw how unbelievably idealistic, how unlikely this would be, the hypocrisy surrounding it. But he still had the view that this is the most important thing, the Declaration. It's the most important thing any of us will do. Here's why. It's an aspirational gift to humanity. It's not even for Americans. It's for the world. What we are doing here, whether this works or not, is we're giving the world a new vision for how government may work. And that it includes, as Lincoln would later famously say, of the people, by the people, for the people. We're giving the world it's a paradigm shift. We're giving them a new reality of governance. And in the day and age of the divine right of kings, of dictators and monarchs, this was it was heresy. It was a paradigm shift. So I believe they were sitting there thinking, the 3 of us, because Sherman and Livingston played almost no role, the 3 of us are changing the world as they were doing this. And I think this painting captures it beautifully. And I had one choice for my cover, and fortunately the publisher agreed.
Yeah, it's beautiful. It really is. You mentioned Lincoln, and I watched a talk of yours recently on C-SPAN, and I love how the way you talked about the Gettysburg Address and how Lincoln rebranded, in our language today, the Declaration.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm a big Abe Lincoln fan. I grew up next to Gettysburg. So as a kid, I climbed the cannons and climbed the trees. And when you were allowed to do that in the 60s and 70s. But I'm also a big fan of Harold Holzer. He's a friend. He's probably the greatest Lincoln scholar. I love Harold's work, and he talked about this. So it's not new. Plus, Lincoln wrote about it. But I think part of Lincoln's genius was rebranding, to use present day parlance, reorganizing, reframing, repurposing the entire Civil War as a new birth of freedom. And he borrows for the impetus for the Gettysburg Address, Pericles, his famous funeral oration, which is one of the greatest speeches of antiquity. And I love to think, how could Abraham Lincoln, who maybe never stepped foot in a school, who grew up on the prairie, how would he even know about Pericles, yet alone know that that was the perfect speech to use? But the other thing Lincoln used in the Gettysburg Address was Ben Franklin's view that the Declaration is an aspirational gift to humanity. So Lincoln's famous opening, 7 years ago, that scores 20 years. So that's 87 years. So at the time, November of 1863 was when he gave the speech. Early July of 63 was the Battle of Gettysburg. If you subtract 87 from that, it does not take us back to 1787, which is the Constitutional Convention, nor 1789 when Washington was sworn in and everything started. Because Lincoln notes that we debated slavery during the Constitutional Convention and allowed it to exist. The 3/5 clause and other things. So it's an imperfect document for a perfect end game, you might say. So, but what Lincoln does is 70 takes us back to 1776 because of the aspirational gift of the Declaration. You know, Lincoln's view was this is the last best hope for democracy, the last best hope for humanity if we don't win the war. But what we're trying to show the world is there's a new vision against slavery, against, bondage, and for rights and for people to come together. So Lincoln really channels Franklin. And, I don't know. I find it, Ben Franklin and Abraham Lincoln are irresistibly fascinating to me. And just you can't help but not like them, but love them. So I thought that was a nice connection that Lincoln, being the student of history that he was so well read that he not only knew Pericles' funeral oration, but he knew Ben Franklin's views of the Declaration as an aspirational gift and put his finger on the perfect point at what I think is the greatest speech ever given in history, the Gettysburg Address, a whopping 2 minutes long.
Compared to the governor of Pennsylvania's lengthy speech right before that, unforgettable speech.
There was a guy, Edward Everett, who gave a 2-hour long whopper. Everett was something of a narcissist. He had been the president of Harvard, and he made much of the speech about himself, which is so fantastically inappropriate when you're at the site where there were thousands of casualties, and this bloody Civil War is now at the midway point. 1863 is 2 years in, 2 years to go. To not understand it. And then Lincoln gets up, and says, and with great humility, the world will little note nor long remember what we say here today. That's the only thing he got wrong. After Everett basically said, the world will remember what I'm saying,
Yeah.
Lincoln says, Everett says, I'm here, I feel the pain. I will now dedicate. Lincoln says, quote unquote, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground, beyond what those men have done. I mean, with great humility, and takes us back to the Declaration. And when he finished the speech, as that nobody clapped, not because they didn't like it, because I imagine people sitting there, like after Saving Private Ryan or Schindler's List, or after, going to Arlington National Cemetery, you just sit and you're trying to make sense out of what you just experienced. I suspect the audience was sitting there thinking, we've never heard anything like it. And Lincoln walks by Edward Everett and he says, quote unquote, he says, well, that went over like a wet blanket. So quintessential Lincoln, some humor in the midst of genius, but the connection there to Ben Franklin is profound. And those two views of the Declaration are my favorite ways of looking at this remarkable document.
Were there figures during this period, Robert, whom history has unfairly overlooked?
Yeah. So, I've had the great honor of interviewing David McCullough a few times, Doris Kearns Goodwin, a lot of these folks. I'm a big Gordon Wood fan, a Joe Ellis fan.
Yeah.
Harold Holzer, and so it's cool when you get to talk to and work with people that you really really admire. Um, and one of the questions I always ask is, it's inevitable in writing a book. You find people that you fall in love with, right? And you didn't know much about. And surely there's always these people that pop out. And then your challenge is to make sure that you treat them with fairness. But you put their name, you bring them back into the narrative, but you make sure you do it in a way that's accurate and objective rather than showing that you fell in love with them. One of mine was a woman named Mary Catherine Goddard. So the first declaration, the Dunlap broadside, July 4, 76, they didn't sign it. Only Hancock and Thompson, the president's secretary, just noted that it was done, but they all didn't sign it for I think two reasons. One, nobody signed documents back then, and two, they would be hanged by the British if they affixed their names to this instrument, as Ben Franklin used to say. So starting on August 2nd, 76, they said, maybe we ought to sign this. And it took them weeks and weeks and weeks because, as I always say, they didn't have cell phones. They couldn't find one another. And some folks who had been serving in early July of 76 were no longer serving. Others went off to fight in the war, so they had trouble finding them. A few folks, the British were actually pretty much hunting them down. They were on the run. So it took weeks. And then in mid-January of 77, there was time to print it. But the concern was, by then the British had said, look, this is treason. We will hunt you down. And they were starting to hunt people down. And they were eyeing up Philadelphia. So, I mean, it was a death penalty. Benjamin Rush, who was the famous surgeon from Philadelphia, he said, if we sign this, we're signing our death warrants. So people didn't want to print it. And Mary Catherine Goddard, a woman, came forward and printed it. And I love I think anybody that likes history both loved and hated the Nicolas Cage movie National Treasure. Loved it because of his history, right? And he's like an Indiana Jones person, belongs in a library or museum, right? So you love it, but it was just so wildly inaccurate that you're that cringing thinking they could have made it better. But the whole premise of National Treasures, there's secrets on the Declaration. There actually are secrets on the Declaration. The second printed copy with all the signatures, Mary Catherine Goddard, a woman's name is on it. She insisted on typesetting her name at the bottom. And knowing that the British were going to hunt them down, her view was basically, let them come get me. She writes Baltimore, comma, in Maryland, printed by Mary Catherine Goddard. Let them know I'm here. So she inspired people. And, given the, unimaginable level of sexism at the time, for her to be as prominent as she was, I mean, she printed newspapers, she printed government documents, she printed revolutionary heresy and materials, she printed I guess you could say, the main declaration. Wow. And she lived through the war. The British didn't get her. But just I found her to be interesting and compelling. And it's one thing to say something; it's another thing to put your money where your mouth is. And by that time, if Las Vegas was around back then, the odds would have been steep that we against us. We weren't going to win this thing. And yet she printed it and put her name on it and stood behind it. So I just imagine how proud Abigail Adams and so many women must have been to see a woman doing that, and how impressed a lot of the men were who were hesitant to put their own name on it. And here she is. Yeah. So yeah, I really, really like Mary Catherine Goddard. And again, we've forgotten her. So I had a lot of objectives in this book, a lot of goals. You always do. But one was to bring some of these names back into the narrative, like her and Dunlap, the immigrant who printed the first one, because these are not, I didn't learn about them when I was in 8th grade civics, and I didn't learn about them in my American history class when I was in college. And they deserve to be brought back into the narrative. They were just as heroic and just as important as John Adams, and I'm a big John Adams fan.
Yeah, like Goddard, Robert, why was it important for you also to highlight enslaved individuals and indigenous peoples too?
indigenous folks had a difficult decision to make. If the British win, we're screwed. If the Americans win, we're really screwed. So they sort of took the lesser of two evils by a lot of them backing the British, and there were different nations that were pro, loyalist, pro crown, and others that were pro Americans. The Catawba down in the South, they supported the American militia. There were, and even within tribes and Indian nations, because of the lack of a written record, but from British and colonial American reports that survive, you saw divisions within those tribes. You can imagine a nation, their council sitting down with the chief, saying, "Who do we support? Um, this war is going to engulf all of us, and we're in trouble either way." But a lot of them made the decision to support the British because they were the lesser of two evils. Same with enslaved individuals. They had an awful decision to make. Um, but there was something called the Dunmore Proclamation for Lord Dunmore, and it was the British basically offered enslaved individuals, if you can make it to a British camp, um, you'll be free. And a lot of them did. They went to British camps, and now the British held their word. They freed folks. Now, you didn't necessarily live a good life as soon as you made it to the camp. They had you washing their clothes and preparing meals, and so they had to work. And of course, they're following the army around, or they're stuck in a miserable camp. But the promise of freedom was there. So whereas if the Americans won, and sadly, when the war ended in fall of 1783, and the British packed up and skedaddled, Evacuation Square, right there by the Bull and Wall Street, by that little intersection is called Evacuation Square. That's where the British finally left and set sail, and everybody was, good riddance. Um, there were challenges in those final weeks leading up to that because a lot of Southern slavers had vigilante folks that were just in the North, South, everywhere, hunting down blacks to return them to slavery. And the British, they're too busy packing up, right? And George Washington's army is in no position to start policing. They hadn't been paid. They wanted to go home. So you have this horrible period, and not a lot has been done on it. I've actually been chewing on the idea of writing a book on this. But a couple brave British and a handful of enslaved individuals who became literate and could read and write, they put together something called the Book of Negroes, where they try to collect as many names of former enslaved individuals who made it to the British lines. And now they're threatened with being returned to slavery, sort of like that movie 12 Years a Slave, I guess you could say. And the British made good. A couple of them worked hard to find all these folks, and they sailed them to like Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada, so that they could be free. So enslaved individuals, American Indians, saw just this as a horrible choice. And really, for the Native population, the revolution is the beginning of the end of Native self-determination on the continent because we won.
And finally, Robert, what would you like readers, as we approach the 250th birthday of America, to take away from Declaration?
If you could go back to July of 76, you'd find that the people were divided. You would find that they were complaining about their leaders. You would find that we were amassing a massive debt. You would find that day-to-day people were worried about the cost of goods and everything, services, because the price skyrocketed. People were worried about unemployment. So c'est plus ça change. The more the things change, the more they stay the same.
Yeah.
And I'm not minimizing the precarious situation with which we find ourselves in today, and threats to the Constitution, the rule of law, democracy, and all that is. I don't sleep anymore, but. If you go back and you just think about the lives of those colonists and what they were about, so put the reader. I always like to try to put myself in the shoes, the skin of the people involved, and imagine what they were doing, and these great founders. And what I try to do in the book is I've always had that to be a fly on the wall you
Yeah.
and Ben Franklin's at one of his salons where everybody's having a good time, to try to bring these moments to life and these interesting characters to life, put some flesh and bones on the marble foundation we've given them. So yeah, I hope folks do. But and again, I appreciate you what you do and also your interest in the book. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Robert. Robert P. Watson's new book is Declaration, the Story of American Independence, a compelling and deeply researched look at the creation of America's founding document and the people, conflicts, and ideals behind it. This is part of our Speaking of Writers America 250 series, and the book offers fresh insight into a pivotal moment in history whose impact continues to shape the nation today. Thank you for joining me. And thank you for watching and for listening to the Speaking of Writers podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to it on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, and wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Steve Richards. I will talk to you again next time.